Just before dawn off Santa Catalina Island, a patrol boat eased through black water toward a small shape drifting in the swell. The sky was the color of bruised glass. The wind barely breathed. A crewman leaned over the rail and saw a pale face, hair fanned like seaweed, fabric clinging to a slight body rising and falling with the tide. When they pulled her alongside, the ocean gave back a name the world already knew: Natalie Wood. Hours earlier, the weekend had been ordinary by Hollywood standards. A yacht called Splendour, a famous husband, a famous co-star, too many drinks, too much talk. Music from the cabin, voices on the deck, a dinghy tied off at the stern, knocking idly against fiberglass. Then midnight, and the island darkened to a silhouette. What happened next has lived in rumor ever since. The official story was quick and clean: an accident, a tragic drowning. But clean stories don't leave this many jagged edges. Friends remembered Natalie's fear of dark water. The captain would later change his account. The men on board, her husband Robert Wagner and actor Christopher Walken, offered versions that overlapped, then drifted apart. A neighbor on the island said he heard voices carrying across the harbor, anger skimming the surface between boat lights. The dinghy somehow ended up loose. By morning, Natalie didn't. She was 32, with a career most actors never touch. Miracle on 34th Street as a child, Rebel Without a Cause, Splendour in the Grass, West Side Story. A woman who had grown up on sets, who could turn vulnerability into fire on camera, who learned early that the spotlight warms and burns in equal measure. She knew how to be looked at. She also knew how quickly looking becomes staring, and staring becomes judgment. When the news broke, Los Angeles froze. The papers wrote in the language of certainty. The city read in the language of doubt. How does a woman who feared deep water end up alone in it? Why did the story shift between breakfast and sundown? Why did the pieces fit only if you pressed them until they cracked? The death certificate would say drowning and other undetermined factors. That last phrase is where the mystery still breathes. But a night in November doesn't begin on a coroner's line. It begins in a small apartment with Russian lullabies and a little girl named Natalia who watched the world through wide, alert eyes. Before the yacht and the island and the headlines, there was a child who learned to be perfect because the camera demanded it, who traded a childhood for a career that never let her stop performing, even when the director yelled cut. To understand the woman the ocean took, we have to meet the girl the world invented. That is where the first fault lines appeared. That is where this story truly starts. Shall I continue with Part 2, Childhood and Origins? Long before she was Natalie Wood, she was Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko, the daughter of Russian immigrants who arrived in California with little more than hope and accent-heavy English. She was born on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco, a child of the Great Depression and of parents haunted by the ghosts of a homeland they'd fled. Her mother, Maria, was beautiful, ambitious, and relentlessly controlling. She dreamed of a life far from struggle, a life of lights, applause, and cameras. When a film crew visited their small town to shoot a scene, Maria saw her chance. She dressed her daughter in her best clothes, pushed her toward the director, and begged him to take a look. Natalia was only 4, but when the camera turned, she smiled like she had been waiting for it all her life. The director saw something, a spark, a kind of innocence that didn't fade under the harsh glow of studio lights. Within months, Natalia was working steadily in films. Her family changed their name to Wood, a name easier for Hollywood tongues to pronounce. And just like that, Natalia became Natalie Wood, the little girl who could cry on cue, smile through exhaustion, and make an audience believe anything she wanted them to. But childhood, for Natalie, was not childhood at all. Her mother ruled every moment, what she wore, what she ate, who she saw. Maria warned her constantly, "Smile, baby. The camera loves you only when you smile." She told her daughter that fame was survival, that losing it would mean losing everything. When Natalie's father tried to protest, Maria silenced him. Their marriage broke under the weight of ambition. By age 10, Natalie had worked in more films than most adults ever would. Her breakout came in Miracle on 34th Street, 1947, where her wide-eyed innocence charmed the world. But even then, she understood something the audience didn't. The miracle was scripted, the smile rehearsed. Between takes, she would ask her mother, "Did I do it right?" And Maria would nod, but never hug her. Hollywood adored the child star who never seemed to age. Studio executives called her professional, meaning obedient. Directors called her fearless, meaning she did what she was told. Every compliment was a lesson, every role another reminder that she existed to be seen. By the time she was 16, she had already outgrown the roles that made her famous. The transition from child to woman on screen was brutal. The men around her, producers, journalists, co-stars, began to look at her differently. The same charm that once earned her applause now drew attention of another kind. And as she learned to smile through it, the little girl who once dreamed of the camera began to understand the price of being its favorite. Fame had found her early, and it wasn't letting go. By the mid-1950s, Hollywood had grown up, and so had Natalie Wood. The little girl who once sold Christmas miracles was now a young woman with a face the camera could not ignore and a depth of emotion that startled even seasoned directors. She was 17 when she starred in Rebel Without a Cause, 1955, opposite James Dean and Sal Mineo, a film that would define a generation. On screen, she played Judy, the lonely girl desperate for love. Off-screen, she wasn't far from that role. The movie captured something raw and real about her, something that didn't need to be acted. When Rebel premiered, Natalie was no longer the studio's obedient child. She was Hollywood's newest obsession. She earned an Academy Award nomination, but what she truly won was visibility. Everyone suddenly knew her name. Fame came fast, dazzling, and disorienting. Natalie was invited to every premiere, every party, every photograph that could prove she'd arrived. But the lights that adored her also burned her from the inside. She once confessed to a friend, "I live in a glass box. I can see everyone, and everyone can see me, but no one can really touch me." It was around this time she met Robert Wagner, a rising actor 5 years older and already a heartthrob. He was handsome, polished, and seemed to belong to the world Natalie had spent her life chasing. The press called them Hollywood's golden couple. She called him R.J. At 19, she married him in a fairy tale ceremony surrounded by flashbulbs and envy. For a while, it seemed perfect. Two movie stars in love, sharing the same dream. But fame rarely allows two hearts to beat in the same rhythm. The industry adored their beauty, but ignored their humanity. Rumors of affairs, jealousy, and distance began to swirl. The same headlines that once celebrated them now hinted at cracks beneath the perfection. Natalie's career soared higher. Splendour in the Grass, 1961, and West Side Story, 1961, made her one of the most sought-after actresses in the world. She was elegant, magnetic, vulnerable, all at once. Yet the roles that made her powerful also mirrored her own reality. Women, broken by love, struggling to keep their hearts intact beneath public scrutiny. Off-screen, the fairy tale was crumbling. Her marriage to Wagner ended in 1962 amid whispers of betrayal and emotional distance. Natalie was devastated. She was 24 and already divorced, already exhausted from a life lived under constant watch. She threw herself into work, searching for meaning in scripts, applause, and fleeting romance. The dream she had chased since childhood had come true, but like all dreams, it was already beginning to dissolve, and waiting beneath the glitter of success was the shadow of something darker, the loneliness fame could never fill. By the late 1960s, Natalie Wood was the kind of star Hollywood no longer knew how to make. She had beauty, grace, and a haunting fragility that drew audiences to her like moths to a flame. On screen, she was luminous. Off screen, she was quietly unraveling. After her divorce from Robert Wagner, Natalie tried to reinvent herself. She dated, she traveled, she sought peace in a world that only wanted her perfection. But peace was elusive. She had spent nearly her entire life performing, first for her mother, then for studios, then for the public. She didn't know who she was without the applause. Hollywood had changed. The studio system that once protected its stars had collapsed, replaced by a rougher, more cynical industry. Natalie was no longer the ingenue. She was a woman in her 30s, trying to stay relevant in a business obsessed with youth. She accepted fewer roles, but when she did act, she reminded everyone of her brilliance. Her performances in Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, 1969, and Inside Daisy Clover, 1965, revealed a woman unafraid to expose her vulnerability. Still, something in her life remained incomplete. Fame had given her everything except stability. Then, almost a decade after their painful split, fate brought her back to Robert Wagner. He had changed, or so it seemed. He was older, calmer, less reckless. They remarried in 1972 in an intimate ceremony surrounded by family and friends. It was supposed to be a second chance at the love that had once defined her life. For a while, it worked. Natalie seemed happy again. She balanced motherhood with her career, appearing in television, films, and smaller roles that kept her connected to Hollywood without consuming her. Friends said she was radiant, laughing easily, protective of her daughters, more grounded than ever before. But even in her new peace, shadows lingered. She still feared deep water, a terror that had followed her since childhood. She had spoken about it often, how she could never shake the feeling that something terrible waited beneath the surface. In interviews, she joked about it, but her friends knew it was no joke. In 1981, Natalie began filming Brainstorm alongside Christopher Walken, a younger actor known for his intensity. On set, their chemistry was undeniable. The tabloids speculated, hinting at jealousy from Wagner. Natalie brushed it off, but tension brewed quietly behind closed doors. That November, the three, Natalie, Wagner, and Walken, planned a weekend trip on Wagner's yacht, the Splendour. They would sail to Catalina Island, relax, and escape the Hollywood noise. For Natalie, it was meant to be a small break from the spotlight. But the ocean that had terrified her all her life was about to become the setting of her final act. The weekend of November 28, 1981, began quietly. The yacht Splendour glided through the dark waters off Catalina Island carrying 4 people: Natalie Wood, her husband Robert Wagner, her co-star Christopher Walken, and the ship's captain, Dennis Davern. From a distance, it was a picture of elegance. Hollywood's golden couple entertaining a fellow actor under the stars. Up close, it was far more complicated. The group dined at a restaurant on the island that evening. Witnesses remembered laughter, expensive wine, and a touch of tension. Natalie and Robert's relationship had always been passionate, full of love, jealousy, and sharp words. Back aboard the yacht later that night, the waves began to rise, and so did the arguments. The captain would later recall voices raised, glasses breaking, the thud of footsteps across the deck. Natalie, he said, looked upset, her face pale against the soft boat light. At some point, Christopher Walken retreated to his cabin, uncomfortable with the growing tension between husband and wife. The fight between Natalie and Robert continued, echoing across the dark water. And then, silence. When the captain emerged later, Natalie was gone. Her stateroom was empty. The small inflatable dinghy tied to the yacht had drifted away. Robert told him she must have gone to secure it, but everyone on board knew Natalie's fear of deep water. She would never have gone alone into the dark, especially not barefoot, wearing only a nightgown and a jacket. Hours passed before anyone called the Coast Guard. At dawn, about a mile away from the yacht, searchers found her body floating face down, her hair tangled in seaweed. The dinghy was nearby, rocking gently in the tide. The autopsy showed bruises on her arms and legs, consistent, the coroner said, with someone trying to climb back onto a boat. The headlines the next morning were merciless. Natalie Wood dies in mystery drowning. The public was stunned. The press demanded answers. How could a woman so afraid of water die this way? Why had the people on the yacht waited so long to report her missing? And why did the stories of that night, told by Wagner, Walken, and the captain, never quite match? The coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning. The case was closed within weeks. But no one believed it was that simple. Friends whispered about her fear, her marriage, the tension on the yacht. Rumors of foul play filled tabloids and talk shows. Robert Wagner denied all accusations, insisting Natalie's death was a tragic accident. Christopher Walken refused to speak publicly about that night at all, and so Natalie Wood, the girl who had lived her entire life beneath the spotlight, became the subject of a mystery that even Hollywood couldn't script. A starlet who once conquered the silver screen was now immortalized not for her films, but for the questions her death left behind. In the months that followed Natalie Wood's death, Hollywood mourned, but not quietly. The tabloids turned her tragedy into theater. Headlines screamed theories. Talk shows speculated about murder, jealousy, even cover-ups. Her funeral was crowded with the very faces who had built her myth. Co-stars, producers, directors, and strangers who'd only ever known her through movie screens. Robert Wagner stood at the front, stoic, shattered, surrounded by suspicion. The official story remained simple: accidental drowning. But nothing about it felt simple. Fans sent letters to the police demanding answers. Friends insisted Natalie would never have gone out alone in the dark. And Captain Dennis Davern, the man who had been on the Splendour that night, started to change his story. Years later, in interviews, Davern confessed that he believed Wagner and Natalie had argued violently before she disappeared. He claimed Wagner had delayed calling for help. He said the night had been filled with shouting, anger, and fear. When these revelations surfaced, the case, once closed and forgotten, was suddenly alive again. In 2011, 30 years after Natalie's death, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation. Forensic experts re-examined her autopsy. They found bruises on her arms, her wrists, her thighs that didn't quite match the story of a simple fall into the water. In 2013, the cause of death was officially changed to drowning and other undetermined factors. That phrase, undetermined factors, kept her mystery breathing. Robert Wagner was eventually named a person of interest. He never faced charges and maintained his innocence, calling the tragedy a nightmare that would haunt him forever. Christopher Walken finally broke decades of silence to give a brief statement. She slipped and fell. There's nothing more to say. But there was more. There was always more. Natalie's family, especially her sister Lana Wood, refused to let her memory fade into rumor. Lana spent years speaking publicly, demanding answers, writing books, appearing in documentaries. She wanted the world to remember Natalie not as a corpse in the water, but as the woman who had fought her whole life to be taken seriously. Meanwhile, Natalie's daughters grew up under her shadow. Her eldest, Natasha Gregson Wagner, became an actress too. In 2020, she produced the documentary Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, giving her mother's story back its humanity. For the first time in decades, audiences saw Natalie not as a mystery, but as a mother, a woman who loved deeply, and who had been failed by the world that once adored her. Hollywood began to rewrite her legacy. Retrospectives honored her performances again: West Side Story, Splendour in the Grass, Love with a Proper Stranger. Critics remembered her not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. Luminous, emotional, unforgettable. The investigation remains open, and the questions still echo over the dark water off Catalina Island. But Natalie's story found something close to peace, not through answers, but through remembrance, because the truth may never rise from that sea, but the woman who vanished into it will never truly sink. More than 4 decades have passed since that cold November night, and yet Natalie Wood's name still ripples across time. Part legend, part question, part ache that refuses to fade. Her death remains one of Hollywood's great unsolved mysteries. But her life was pure cinema. Natalie's story is the story of Hollywood itself, beautiful, brilliant, and cruel. She began as a child molded by others, a product of a system that worshiped perfection and punished imperfection. And though she played every role the world demanded of her, child star, ingenue, wife, mother, what she truly wanted was something simple and heartbreakingly human, to be seen, not just watched. She gave everything to the screen. Every tear, every smile, every flicker of fear. In Rebel Without a Cause, she embodied the pain of youth. In Splendour, in the grass, the madness of love. In West Side Story, the dream of belonging. She showed the world not just how to act, but how to feel. That was her gift and her burden. Her death may never be fully understood. The ocean that took her keeps its secrets, silent and endless. But perhaps the meaning of her story lies not in how she died, but in why she mattered. Natalie Wood was proof that fame cannot protect the soul, that even in a world built on fantasy, the cost of being real can be devastating. In the years since, her daughters have carried her memory with grace. Her films are watched anew by audiences who never saw her alive. And every time her image flickers on a screen, eyes bright, voice trembling with emotion, it feels as if she has returned for a moment, reminding us that art can outlive tragedy. She is no longer just the mystery of Catalina Island. She is the echo of a dream that Hollywood itself can't forget. The girl who lived in the light, feared the dark, and vanished into both. Natalie Wood's story will always end with a question, but it's a question that keeps her alive. Was it fate or something far more human that took her from us? Whatever the answer, her legacy remains luminous, fragile, and eternal, like a reflection on still water, shimmering just before the tide pulls it away.